Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest, most chaotic chapters of modern history. The story of a drug so bizarre that it made people believe they were invincible, bulletproof, and occasionally furniture. Welcome to the world of angel dust, or PCP, a chemical that was supposed to revolutionize medicine, but instead turned 1970s America into a live-action fever dream. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of strange bedtime history. And seriously, thank you for suggesting this topic. It was a fascinating one to dive into. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somewhere out there someone's wide awake at 2 a.m, learning about the drugs that made people punch through walls. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable. Because tonight, we're not talking about fairy tales, we're talking about chemistry gone rogue. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be so high you think you can fight a car? Or why entire police departments in the 70s started carrying extra handcuffs for the guy on PCP? Or how a perfectly respectable pharmaceutical company created one of the most feared street drugs in history, and then tried to rebrand it as horse tranquilizer when things went sideways. What did it feel like to be a psychiatrist in the 1950s handing out test doses of PCP to medical interns, only to watch them lose track of time and identity? Or to be a cop in 1979 Los Angeles staring at a naked man who just ran through a window and asked calmly if he could borrow your flashlight? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1956, the year angel dust was born. The lab smells like antiseptic and optimism. You have a white coat, a clipboard, and absolutely no idea that you've just unleashed one of the weirdest substances the 20th century will ever know. It all starts in a shiny pharmaceutical lab, where scientists at Park Davis are trying to invent a new kind of anesthetic, one that keeps patients numb but conscious. They call it phencyclidine, or PCP. At first, it's brilliant. Patients don't feel pain, don't need deep sedation, and wake up quickly. Perfect. Except for one tiny problem. Some of them also wake up screaming at the wallpaper. You're a researcher in 1956, wearing a starched white lab coat, holding a clipboard, and radiating optimism. The world has just discovered colour television, the polio vaccine, and a kind of coffee you can make instantly. Science feels unstoppable, and here you are, synthesizing what you're certain will become the future of modern medicine. You and your team inject the first test subjects with your promising new compound, watching as their heart rates stabilize and their faces relax into serene calm. For a few minutes, it's textbook anesthesia. Then someone opens their eyes mid-surgery and asks if they've died. PCP was supposed to be a medical miracle, a way to keep people comfortable through surgery without the dangerous respiratory suppression caused by ether or chloroform. The problem was that instead of just disconnecting pain, it disconnected reality. One moment a patient would be drifting peacefully. The next, they'd be trying to conduct an orchestra made entirely of invisible bats. Recovery rooms turned into philosophical forums. Patients woke up unbothered by their incisions, but deeply concerned about the concept of time. Doctors took notes in neat cursive, pretending not to be alarmed. One recorded that his patient believed she was made of glass and might shatter if touched. Another simply wrote, "Patient unresponsive to pain, but attempted to leave body." Yet, no one panicked. This was the 1950s. They still gave cigarettes to new mothers and prescribed amphetamines for tired housewives. A little hallucination? Hardly a deal breaker. In the boardroom at Park Davis, the executives were thrilled. The drug worked, technically. It blocked pain, reduced bleeding, and allowed for shorter recovery times. They gave it the friendly brand name Cernil, and envisioned smiling patients sitting up post-surgery, thanking their doctors for the gentle, modern touch of science. What they got instead was one nurse describing a post-op patient as physically calm but spiritually elsewhere. And that's when the trouble began. Recovery rooms became unpredictable. Some patients emerged euphoric, laughing and humming. Others emerged furious, convinced they'd been abducted by aliens. One man woke up convinced he was a bird and ran directly into a supply closet. Hospitals began filing reports. Park Davis, alarmed but still hopeful, sent polite letters reminding doctors that these reactions were rare and manageable. By the 10th letter, the tone changed from optimistic to apologetic. Then came the headlines. A few journalists caught wind of the miracle anesthetic with psychedelic side effects. One headline read, "Patients feel no pain," or anything else. That's never a great look for a company trying to sound respectable. Sales slowed. Hospitals quietly switched back to the old-fashioned anesthetics that at least didn't make people believe they were melting. Park Davis called an emergency meeting. They couldn't just abandon years of research, so they rebranded. The drug would no longer be for humans. No. It would be for animals. Big animals. Very calm animals. Thus was born Sernilan, veterinary anesthetic. The same compound, once hailed as a wonder of modern surgery, was now marketed to sedate horses, cattle, and the occasional confused goat. And in that strange twist of fate, humanity's great medical innovation was officially downgraded to cownap juice. But even that wasn't the end. Somewhere, in a basement lab or a bored veterinary office, someone must have looked at that little bottle of Sernilan and thought, I wonder what happens if I try it. And soon, the chemical meant to make surgeries peaceful would start making headlines again. Only this time, the patients weren't lying on operating tables. They were standing shirtless in parking lots, claiming to be invincible. For now, though, in 1956, the scientists at Park Davis are still optimistic. They're celebrating another successful trial, blissfully unaware that they've just created the future's most infamous party drug. The beakers are clean, the clipboards are full, and outside the lab the world hums with post-war confidence. Humanity's greatest minds are taming nature one molecule at a time, until nature decides to bite back. And as you hang up your lab coat for the night, you feel proud. You've made something extraordinary, something that blocks pain, severs fear, and separates mind from body. You just don't realize yet that you've also made history's strangest anesthetic. A chemical miracle with a bad sense of humor and a long, chaotic future ahead of it. In the early clinical trials, patients describe leaving their bodies, floating above the room, and meeting the Lord. To scientists in 1956, that sounds like data. To everyone else, it sounds like a bad acid trip wearing a lab coat. Still, Park Davis writes it all down and calls it mild dissociation. A poetic way to say, Jerry just fought an invisible bear. You're standing in a hospital ward that smells like rubbing alcohol and misplaced confidence. A patient lies on the table, fresh out of surgery, eyes open and glassy. His pulse is steady, his breathing calm, the anesthesia worked. But then he starts talking to someone who isn't there. You lean closer. He's asking the ceiling for forgiveness, and then, very gently, he tries to hug it. The nurse takes notes, like this is all perfectly normal, and the doctor says, fascinating. Because if there's one thing scientists love, it's pretending they're not terrified. In these early trials, PCP wasn't seen as dangerous, it was seen as a breakthrough, a chemical key that unlocked pain without knocking out consciousness. But as the tests went on, something strange kept happening. Patients weren't just numb, they were gone. Their minds drifted somewhere far beyond the room. Some claimed they could see themselves from above, hovering over their own bodies like curious ghosts. One woman described floating through the wall to watch nurses gossip at the desk. Another calmly announced that she'd become pure light. The doctor nodded, scribbled positive spiritual response, and scheduled another test. At first, this was treated as a curiosity. After all, science loves anomalies, right up until they start stacking chairs and singing hymns. Soon, every trial brought new revelations. Some patients said they'd met angels. Others met something less friendly. One man claimed he spoke to God and was told to invest in aluminum. The stock market did admittedly go up, but still, probably not divine intervention. The scientists tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was oxygen deprivation. Maybe the dosage was too high. Maybe the human brain, when disconnected from sensory input, just did whatever it could to fill the silence. But privately, they were uneasy. Not because people were hallucinating, that was expected. They were uneasy because everyone was hallucinating, and often in the same way. Floating, shining, hearing voices and feeling infinite peace, or infinite terror. Whatever PCP did, it wasn't just shutting off pain. It was unplugging reality and plugging in something else entirely. In one infamous test, a young man named Leonard woke up during recovery and calmly began describing heaven. He said he could see his grandmother knitting on a cloud, and that she told him to stop drinking. He hadn't mentioned she was dead. The doctors exchanged glances, the nurse dropped her clipboard, and someone mumbled, "Write it down." Leonard spent the next 3 hours explaining the afterlife in impressive detail, then asked if anyone wanted pie. By this point, Park Davis researchers had a decision to make. Either admit they'd created a portal to the divine, or call it transient post-operative confusion. Guess which one looks better on a report to the FDA, so mild dissociation it was. But the stories spread, inside the hospitals first, then among medical students, then out into the world. Word of a strange anesthetic that could separate mind from body was too good to stay secret. And soon, scientists weren't the only ones curious. Psychiatrists wondered if PCP could help patients explore trauma. Mystics wanted to experience the chemical soul. And somewhere in a smoky basement, a few adventurous grad students wondered if they could talk to God recreationally. By the end of the decade, PCP had moved from surgical tables to psychology labs, where volunteers lined up to experience controlled ego detachment. The volunteers described their trips in surreal poetry, walking through light, merging with sound, becoming timeless. One man described the sensation as like dying, but without the paperwork. The researchers called it dissociative anesthesia. The public called it weird. And behind the sterile language and careful data tables, the scientists of Park Davis began to suspect they'd created something far more powerful than an anesthetic. They had built a key to the back door of human consciousness, a key that, once turned, was very hard to unturn. When the trials finally ended, the doctors locked up the vials, filed their reports, and swore never to administer PCP again outside of a lab. But they'd already opened a Pandora's beaker. The idea was out there now, that you could chemically slip the chains of your body, travel beyond yourself, and maybe come back wiser, or maybe not at all. Years later, when PCP escaped the lab and hit the streets, the same language would return, floating, seeing light, talking to God. Only this time, it wasn't in clinical reports, it was in police statements. But in 1956, it was still a medical marvel, a miracle in a vial, a chemical so powerful it could lift people right out of their own skin and make them believe, if only for a moment, that they'd finally met the divine. Doctors and nurses start to notice that after surgery, some patients treated with PCP don't just recover, they have full-on episodes. They run down hallways, laugh uncontrollably, or try to climb IV poles. At first, researchers blame dosage. Then they try lower doses. Then they stop inviting Jerry back. It begins subtly. A few restless patients here and there, a little confusion, maybe a misplaced hospital gown. But soon, recovery wards start to look less like medical facilities and more like rehearsal spaces for interpretive dance. One patient, moments after a successful appendectomy, calmly removes his IV and announces that he's late for the opera. Another bursts into song mid-stitches. Nurses chase them down the hallways with clipboards and forced smiles, trying to look professional while whispering, "Please stop scaling the curtains, sir. You're a nurse in 1957, still wearing your crisp white uniform, and that cap that looks aerodynamic but isn't. You've just finished monitoring a patient who's been silent for 2 hours, when suddenly he sits up, points at the ceiling and says, 'That's not God. That's Jerry.' There is no Jerry. You look around the room, he's laughing now, not a cheerful laugh, but the kind that makes you question your life choices. You quietly add another note to the chart. Mild euphoria, possible hallucination. Translation: things are getting weird. The doctors hold meetings to discuss the unexpected behavioural responses. They use phrases like post-operative euphoria and dissociative emergence. No one says terrifying, psychotic episode, because that wouldn't sound great in a brochure. Some patients experience bliss, reporting that they feel at one with everything. Others feel paranoia so deep they try to crawl under gurneys to escape invisible pursuers. One poor intern spends an entire night trying to calm a man convinced the IV stand is plotting against him. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Patients under PCP anesthesia don't just wake up, they come back differently. They move like marionettes whose strings have been handed to the wrong puppeteer. They speak nonsense, weep, or stare into the middle distance as if receiving radio signals from another dimension. And yet none of them seem to remember any pain. Their vitals are perfect, but their minds are on vacation. Park Davis still insists the results are promising. The researchers, however, are starting to crack. Sleep-deprived doctors whisper in break rooms about the talking patient in room 12, or the guy who tried to baptize the X-ray machine. The janitor refuses to clean the recovery wing alone anymore. Rumour has it, one patient began reciting nursery rhymes in Latin. Another calmly told the nurse her hands were made of smoke. The staff begins to joke, because when reality starts slipping, humour is cheaper than therapy. And then comes the day no one can laugh about. A patient freshly stitched and sedated bolts upright, rips out his IV, and sprints out of the ward entirely naked, shouting that he's been reborn. 3 orderlies chase him down the stairwell only to find him calmly sitting in the lobby, insisting he's the hospital's new director of consciousness. The incident report reads, "Unusual reaction to anesthetic," which is a very polite way of saying chaos. By now, half the staff wants to stop using PCP altogether, but the pharmaceutical reps keep visiting, smiling through their perfect teeth, assuring everyone that the product performs beautifully when administered properly. Easy for them to say, they're not the ones dodging airborne patients. The nurses start calling it angel shift, those late-night rotations when someone inevitably starts levitating in spirit if not in body. And through it all, the doctors keep testing. They adjust doses, timing and combinations, desperate to tame the chemical. Maybe if they tweak it just right, it'll stop making people argue with the wallpaper. But no matter how carefully they measure, or how softly they inject, the same pattern returns. The patient drifts, the body relaxes, and the mind decides to explore parallel dimensions. Eventually the hospital board steps in. The reports are too strange. The recovery room's too chaotic. One senior physician stands up and says what everyone's been thinking. Maybe this stuff works too well. Park Davis quietly pulls the human use formula from circulation. On paper, it's called temporary discontinuation. In reality, it's surrender. By the time the last vial is locked away, the staff look haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the realization that they've glimpsed something unsettling about the human brain. PCP didn't just numb pain. It peeled back the curtain between body and mind, and what peeked through was not comforting. It was vast, incomprehensible, and occasionally singing show tunes. The hospital returns to normal, or tries to. The hallways are quieter, the IV poles are safe again, and the staff are grateful for their boring, predictable anesthetics. But every so often someone swears they still hear laughter echoing from the old recovery ward. And when they do, they don't go looking. Some experiments, after all, work a little too well. By the early 1960s, Park Davis shelves PCP for humans and quietly repackages it as Cernilan, a tranquilizer for animals. Because if it turns people into glass-eating philosophers, maybe cows will handle it better. Spoiler, they didn't. Somewhere in a fluorescent veterinary office, a well-meaning farmhand is holding down a horse the size of a small Buick, while the veterinarian preps a syringe. "Don't worry," the vet says confidently. "This will calm him right down." Moments later, the horse is trying to climb a fence it previously ignored for 7 years. Turns out livestock react to PCP about as well as humans do, by briefly achieving enlightenment, then forgetting how fences work. The rebranding of PCP as an animal sedative was Park Davis's attempt to salvage a disaster with dignity. The idea was simple. If it's too weird for people, give it to something that can't sue. On paper, it made sense. Surnilan was marketed as an efficient, fast-acting anesthetic for large mammals, perfect for veterinarians wrangling cranky cattle or anxious zoo animals. But in practice, it turned every barnyard into a metaphysical debate. Farmers reported tranquilized pigs that stood up mid-procedure to stare at walls for hours. One vet claimed a cow he'd injected simply lost interest in the concept of being a cow. Still, the company pressed on, flooding veterinary supply chains with glossy brochures showing smiling veterinarians and very calm-looking animals. What they didn't show were the follow-ups, the restless livestock, the unpredictable recoveries, and the increasing number of vets quietly muttering, "I'm switching back to ketamine." Within a few years, Surnilan's reputation had soured even in the animal world. The company could only hope no one outside the veterinary field noticed, but of course, someone did. Enter the era of curiosity, the 1960s, when half of America's scientists were trying to land on the moon and the other half were trying to chemically visit it. In universities across the country, a new generation of researchers started raiding chemical catalogues for anything that sounded remotely psychedelic. LSD had already escaped the lab, mescaline was making the rounds, and then, tucked quietly in the pages of a veterinary supply magazine, someone noticed an intriguing line. Surnilan, phencyclidine hydrochloride, a potent dissociative anesthetic. That single sentence might as well have read, "Gateway to cosmic weirdness, inquire within." The first non-animal test subjects were usually grad students with more enthusiasm than caution. Someone in a basement chemistry lab sprinkled a few milligrams onto a cigarette, took a puff, and 15 minutes later was found staring at his reflection, convinced his skeleton was trying to escape. The report noted, optimistically, significant psychological effects. Word spread fast through academic circles, a drug that separated mind from body, that made you feel everything and nothing all at once. LSD might make you see God, but PCP made you become God, at least until you tried to walk through a wall. By the mid-1960s, PCP was popping up in small experimental clubs and university circles under new, more approachable names: Angel Dust, Peace Pills, and later, Sherms or Love Boat. The irony of those names cannot be overstated. Angel Dust sounds gentle, celestial, something you'd sprinkle on cupcakes, not something that would convince you your neighbour's toaster is a spy. But that was part of its allure. The 1960s counterculture wasn't afraid of danger, it was afraid of boredom. Soon, PCP made the leap from college curiosities to city streets. It was cheap, easy to synthesize, and terrifyingly effective. By the time law enforcement caught on, the drug had already developed a cult reputation, not for bliss, but for sheer unpredictability. One hit could leave you dancing in traffic, 2 could convince you gravity was a hoax. It didn't matter how many warning stories circulated. For some, that was the point. Police departments across the US began filing reports about unusual incidents. Officers encountered suspects seemingly impervious to pain, running barefoot over glass or shrugging off tasers that hadn't even been invented yet. In Los Angeles, paramedics began using new terminology. Acute phencyclidine psychosis. On the street it was called dusting. To the cops it was called Tuesday. Back in the offices of Park Davis, executives maintained a polite silence. The product had been discontinued years earlier, but its ghost lived on in headlines and emergency rooms. They'd set out to create the future of anesthesia, a clean, efficient medical marvel, and instead had accidentally given the world its first real supervillain drug. By the early 1970s, Surnilan was officially banned from veterinary use. quietly erased from catalogues like a family member nobody wanted to talk about. But it was too late. The molecule was out in the wild, in garages, basements and makeshift labs, being mixed, smoked and rediscovered by a new audience that had no idea it was ever meant for horses. The line between medical miracle and urban menace had officially blurred, and in that blur between science and chaos, between sterile laboratories and police sirens, PCP found its permanent home. What began as a sedative for surgery had become a street legend, a warning label, and an uncomfortable reminder that when humanity tries to invent peace in a bottle, it usually ends up inventing something far stranger. Somewhere in the mid-1960s, a group of college students discovers that if you sprinkle Cernulain on parsley and light it up, it doesn't sedate you, it sends you straight to Jupiter. PCP becomes the first drug in history to be smoked accidentally by someone who just wanted to study veterinary medicine and ended up running from the moon. It starts, as most historical disasters do, with good intentions and bad judgment. A few chemistry majors at a Midwestern university have borrowed a small sample of Cernulain from the veterinary lab. They're curious, not malicious. Just the kind of scientifically gifted yet spiritually lost young men who think that testing animal tranquilizers on themselves will look good on a resume. They dry a few flakes on a dish, crush it into powder, and sprinkle it onto parsley, because they read somewhere that parsley burns evenly and doesn't smell suspicious. The plan is to observe the effects objectively. 5 minutes later, one of them is declaring himself the reincarnation of Galileo. At first there's laughter, the giddy nervous kind that always precedes catastrophe. They take turns inhaling the white smoke, expecting mild relaxation. Instead, the room gets quiet. One student blinks rapidly, then says he can see sound. Another insists that time just reversed. The third student calmly informs the group that he no longer needs his body and proceeds to lie perfectly still for an hour, smiling like he's cracked the code of the universe. Someone writes down notes for science. Someone else writes down a will. Within a week, word spreads across campus. Forget LSD. There's a new compound that makes you feel like you're watching your life from the ceiling. The dorm rooms turn into makeshift laboratories, filled with the unmistakable smell of burnt herbs and poor decisions. Students call it angel dust, because it feels heavenly until you try to stand up and discover your legs no longer recognize your authority. Meanwhile, local emergency rooms begin to notice a pattern. Perfectly healthy young people are being brought in talking to walls, laughing at nothing, or trying to pet the air. They're calm one moment, panicked the next, and none of them remember what happened afterward. When doctors ask what they took, they say, nothing, just parsley, which technically isn't a lie, but also not the whole truth. Police reports from the era read like surreal poetry. One officer describes arriving at a dormitory to find a shirtless man conducting an invisible orchestra. Another recounts a student attempting to climb the side of the library because knowledge is higher ground. Nobody's hurt, but everyone's confused, especially the police. This isn't like alcohol or weed. It's something stranger, colder. The kind of high that doesn't make you feel good, just gone. By the late 1960s, PCP begins its quiet migration from campus curiosity to underground experiment. People start dipping cigarettes in liquid Cernulain, calling them wax sticks or sherms. They mix it with other drugs thinking they're diluting the effect, but PCP doesn't dilute. It waits. It hits when it wants. Some users describe feeling nothing for half an hour, only to wake up 3 days later with no recollection, and a story that begins, "You're not going to believe this." But back at Park Davis headquarters, the executives pretend not to notice. Officially, Cernulain is still an animal tranquilizer. Unofficially, it's now the most unpredictable street drug in America, and it hasn't even gone national yet. The chemists who developed it read newspaper reports about angel dust outbreaks with the same sinking feeling you get when you see your ex trending on Twitter for arson. The strangest part, no one's sure why smoking PCP hits so differently. When ingested or injected, it acts as a sedative. But when burned, something happens to the molecules. They vaporize, rush straight to the brain, and open the trapdoor beneath consciousness. Users describe feeling detached from their bodies, like they're watching themselves from across the room. Others claim they see colours that don't exist. One man insists he talked to God, who told him to hydrate. By the time the 1970s arrive, PCP has crossed over completely. It's no longer a lab experiment, it's a cultural virus. The drug travels from campus parties to urban neighbourhoods, from psychology conferences to back alleys. Wherever it goes, confusion follows. Police start training for PCP incidents. Hospitals build new protocols. And yet, despite the chaos, some people keep seeking it, chasing that one strange, euphoric moment when gravity forgets your name. Because for all its horror stories, PCP had something that fascinated people. That whisper of invincibility, that glimpse of a world without fear or pain. A chemical that could lift you out of your body, above your troubles, into the infinite, if only for a few minutes, before reality dragged you back down again. It began as a veterinary sedative and became a spiritual rocket. And it all started because a few curious students in lab coats wanted to feel something new. They did. They felt everything, all at once, and then forgot it completely. By 1970, PCP leaves the lab and hits the streets. Dealers call it angel dust, peace pills, or love boat. It sounds wholesome, until someone takes 2 hits and decides they can wrestle a mailbox. The drug spreads through American cities faster than polyester leisure suits. The transformation happens quietly. What began as a laboratory sedative and a college curiosity becomes the latest sensation of the underground drug market. The 1970s were already one long chemistry experiment. LSD was still humming through the counterculture. Quaaludes were the unofficial mascot of disco, and cocaine had just been promoted from rich man's caffeine to personality enhancer. And into this glittery pharmacological carnival wandered PCP, colourless, odourless, and ready to erase your entire sense of self for the price of a pack of cigarettes. It doesn't take long before it earns a reputation. Dealers learn that customers don't want Cernilin, the technical name. They want something catchy, something with wings. So they call it angel dust. Poetic, deceptive, almost divine. They sprinkle it on joints or cigarettes dipped in embalming fluid, creating sherms or wet sticks. The smell is sharp, chemical, metallic, like licking a battery wrapped in regret. It's cheap to make, easy to hide, and impossible to predict. You light it up, you take a hit, and within minutes the world starts folding in on itself like a funhouse mirror. You're floating, but you're also stuck. You can feel your heart beating, but you're not entirely sure it's yours. Your friends' voices stretch like rubber bands, and gravity starts feeling like a personal choice. Some people laugh, some panic. Some just stare at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. At first, it's underground, a word-of-mouth curiosity. But then, as with every drug that promises transcendence, demand explodes. PCP moves from dorm rooms to dance floors, from late-night parties to back alleys. In cities like Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. and New York, it becomes a quiet epidemic. Bags of white powder trade hands in parking lots under streetlights, each one promising a trip beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond control, and for a while it works, until it doesn't. Because PCP doesn't have stages of intoxication. There's no gentle slope, no steady fade-in. It's a trapdoor. 1 minute you're euphoric, floating through music and neon haze. The next you're convinced the walls are breathing and the streetlight is plotting against you. And unlike other drugs, there's no easy way back. Once it grabs your brain, it holds on until it's done with you. Emergency rooms start filling up with patients who don't bleed, don't respond to pain, and don't stop moving. Paramedics coin a new phrase. PCP strength. Urban legends spread. Men running through glass, women walking into traffic unharmed, people handcuffed, shackled, and still fighting invisible wars. Newspapers run wild with headlines like Angel Dust turns man into monster and police battle superhuman suspects. But beneath the hysteria, there's a sad, human core. PCP's victims aren't villains or monsters. They're people looking for an escape hatch from lives already too heavy to carry. The 1970s are a decade of disillusionment. Vietnam veterans coming home with trauma, urban poverty at record highs, entire communities gutted by broken promises and cheap drugs. For some, angel dust isn't a thrill. It's a vacation from reality, a chemical pause button. Meanwhile, dealers love it. PCP costs pennies to produce and can be cut into nearly anything. Mint leaves, oregano, cigarette tobacco. It sells under a dozen names, travelling through the same neighbourhoods that once sold heroin and now hum with neon and disco beats. People pass joints that don't smell right but smoke anyway. And soon, the laughter turns into sirens. Police officers, untrained and unprepared, start filing surreal reports. Suspects mumbling about floating above their own bodies. Arrests that take 6 officers and a stretcher. Officers joke grimly that if someone's naked and shouting about God, they're on PCP. It becomes folklore, the drug that makes you feel like Superman and ends with you waking up in a hospital gown with 2 broken arms and a court date. By the mid-1970s, angel dust has become more than a street name. It's a cultural symbol of chaos. Politicians point to it as proof that America is losing control. News anchors call it a plague. Communities call it a curse. But at its core, it's still the same chemical dreamed up in a clean lab, designed to stop pain. A drug meant to silence the body now silences empathy. A chemical that made people numb on operating tables now leaves them numb to consequence. And so, science meets the street, not with applause, but with flashing lights. The miracle anesthetic has officially gone rogue, traded its white lab coat for a dirty glass vial, and found a new kind of fame, the kind that can't be patented, only survived. The disco decade wasn't just bell-bottoms and Bee Gees. It was inflation, disillusionment, and people desperate to feel invincible again after Vietnam. Enter PCP, a chemical shortcut to detachment. It didn't just numb pain, it numbed reality itself. Picture it. 1973. The country smells like gasoline and hairspray. The war is over, but no one feels like they've won. Factories are closing, prices are climbing, and the American dream has started wheezing like a used Chevy on its last tank of optimism. People are exhausted, spiritually, politically, emotionally. And into that cultural hangover walks angel dust, wearing a lab coat and a smirk, promising peace through chemistry. The timing couldn't have been better, or worse. America had just spent a decade trying to feel something. LSD made people feel cosmic. Weed made them feel chill. Cocaine made them feel like they could do taxes at 4 a.m. But PCP offered something entirely different. Nothingness. A complete separation from fear, pain, or consequence. It didn't lift your mood, it vaporized it. For a generation that had seen assassinations, riots, and a war broadcast on television that sounded like bliss. And so, the drug spread, first through cities, then suburbs, then the collective imagination. It wasn't the drug of rich kids or counterculture poets. PCP found its audience in the cracks of America, working-class neighborhoods, disillusioned veterans, and kids who'd grown up watching their parents' dreams curdle into unpaid bills. It was the chemical version of giving up, but with better marketing. Peace pills, they called it. Angel dust. No one wanted to admit they were buying escape in powder form, so they dressed it up in celestial branding. The 1970s were fertile soil for that kind of delusion. The economy was tanking, the oil crisis was making everyone nervous, and trust in government was somewhere below used car salesmen. Nixon had resigned, disco was pretending everything was fine, and TV shows were trying to distract everyone with laugh tracks and polyester. Underneath the glitter, though, people were terrified. If the 1960s were about changing the world, the 1970s were about surviving it. PCP offered the easiest survival mechanism imaginable: stop caring altogether. And stop caring they did. In cities like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., reports of angel dust freakouts became as common as parking tickets. Hospitals saw waves of users brought in handcuffed or sedated, muttering about flying, dying, or both. Police officers found people running barefoot through traffic, punching windshields, or calmly explaining that they were invisible. It wasn't euphoria, it was chaos. But for a country teetering on the edge of an identity crisis, chaos felt familiar. The irony was impossible to ignore. America had spent the previous decade fighting communism abroad, only to come home and lose a quieter war against its own despair. The soldiers who once stormed jungles now wandered city streets with invisible ghosts in their heads. Many of them turned to drugs, first heroin, then anything that made them forget. PCP became their unofficial therapist. It didn't heal trauma, but it made it inaudible. For a few hours there was no guilt, no flashbacks, no gravity. Just the soft hum of chemical peace. Even the nightlife got in on it. At some clubs, dusted cigarettes were passed around between disco beats, offering patrons a shortcut to transcendence. The strobe lights, the mirrored walls, the pulsing bass, it all blurred into one infinite now. People weren't dancing anymore, they were dissolving. And when the music stopped, they didn't just come down, they crashed hard. Panic attacks, paranoia, psychotic breaks. The morning after was never kind to those who borrowed that kind of serenity. Meanwhile, the media couldn't get enough. Superhuman PCP users terrorize city, one headline read. Another claimed man on angel dust lifts car to save friend, which may or may not have been true, but definitely sold papers. News anchors loved the drama, politicians loved the outrage, and the public loved having something new to fear. In a weird way, PCP became the perfect metaphor for the decade itself, a nation floating above its problems, convinced of its own invincibility, seconds away from collapse. By the end of the 1970s, America had a new enemy. Not a foreign power, not a political movement, but its own brain chemistry. The drug that began in a lab meant to cure pain had become the poster child for a society trying to feel nothing at all. It wasn't just a chemical phenomenon, it was cultural. A nation that once chased dreams was now chasing numbness. And in that strange decade of glitter and gloom, PCP fit right in, the perfect drug for a country pretending to dance while quietly falling apart. Cops start reporting something strange. Suspects on PCP seem unstoppable. They don't feel pain. They punch through doors. They fight 6 officers at once. Whether it's adrenaline, hallucination, or sheer terror, the legend of superhuman PCP strength becomes the urban myth that defines the decade. The stories start small, whispers from night shifts and precinct break rooms. Did you hear about that guy last week? Took 3 tasers, broke the cuffs, and kept running. Soon, the anecdotes evolve into full-blown folklore. Every city has one. A dusted man who fought off 5 officers, a woman who lifted a car, a teenager who ran through a plate glass window and walked away smiling. It spreads faster than police radio chatter. A myth powered by fear, adrenaline, and maybe just a hint of exaggeration. From the outside, it seems impossible. How could anyone become superhuman just by smoking something that came out of a veterinary lab? But PCP didn't make people strong, it made them feel strong. The drug's dissociative effects cut the brain's connection to pain, fear, and limitation. When your body thinks you're a god, it acts accordingly. Muscles that would normally seize up under stress suddenly keep firing. Bones fracture, but you don't notice. Tendons tear, but the mind insists keep going. It wasn't magic. It was biology in full rebellion. Police officers in the 1970s weren't trained for that. Most had dealt with drunks and the occasional brawl, not a hallucinating person who felt invincible, and believed the laws of physics were optional. Some officers described scenes straight out of a nightmare, a suspect running full speed through a locked door, another pulling handcuffs apart like cheap jewellery. It didn't matter if the stories were half true. Once they hit the evening news, they became gospel. Soon, the phrase superhuman strength started appearing in official reports. It became shorthand for chaos, a code word for this person cannot be reasoned with. The problem was the myth worked both ways. It didn't just scare civilians, it scared cops too. Officers began approaching any erratic suspect like they were about to wrestle the Hulk. Tensions escalated, confrontations turned violent faster, and the legend grew stronger with every broken door and bloodied uniform. Meanwhile, the medical community tried to explain the phenomenon. Doctors pointed out that people on PCP often exhibited what's called analgesia, an absence of pain perception. Combine that with hallucinations and panic, and you've got a recipe for apparent super strength. Some psychiatrists noted that users weren't actually stronger, they were just unstoppable, because they didn't know when to quit. A sober person feels pain and stops. A dusted person feels nothing and keeps charging until their body physically gives out. But Nuance doesn't sell newspapers. The headlines didn't say, phencyclidine disrupts pain receptors. They said, angel dust makes people unkillable. The drug became mythologized, not just dangerous but monstrous. TV specials aired grainy reenactments of dusted rampages, complete with slow-motion shots of shirtless men smashing furniture, while dramatic voiceovers warned suburban parents, it could happen here. By the late 70s, every police training seminar had a section on handling PCP suspects. The instructions were grim and oddly specific. Use multiple officers, avoid chokeholds, keep calm, and never assume the suspect is subdued, even if they appear unconscious. That last part wasn't paranoia. Some PCP users would seem knocked out, only to spring up seconds later like reanimated corpses in a cop drama. One officer called it the Lazarus effect, and of course, with fear came overreaction. Some departments began overusing force, convinced they were fighting superhumans instead of disoriented, terrified people. It became a cycle. Panic fueled brutality, brutality fueled panic. Every encounter turned into proof that the myth was real. If someone on PCP got shot 5 times and still moved, it wasn't invincibility, it was shock and adrenaline. But Nuance had long left the conversation. Meanwhile, in the streets, Angel Dust's reputation reached almost supernatural levels. It wasn't just a drug anymore. It was a legend. Users bragged about it. You can't kill me on dust, some would say, half believing it. Others used it as armor, a chemical shield against fear, pain, or consequence. The myth became a self-fulfilling prophecy. People on PCP acted invincible because they believed they were, and sometimes belief is more powerful than chemistry. By the time the decade ended, superhuman strength wasn't just a police term, it was part of the American imagination. It showed up in movies, news, and late-night TV specials. It turned PCP from a drug into a monster, the invisible enemy lurking in alleyways and dance clubs, capable of turning anyone into a beast. But the truth was simpler, sadder, and more human. PCP didn't give people strength. It took away their limits, their pain, their fear, their sense of self-preservation. It replaced control with chaos and courage with confusion. The people who seemed unstoppable weren't heroes or villains. They were just broken bodies running on borrowed adrenaline, sprinting through the wreckage of their own minds while the world mistook their suffering for power. Local TV anchors start using phrases like drug-crazed man attacks, 4 officers, and angel dust turns citizens into monsters. Every report makes the drug sound like a supernatural plague. Parents panic. Lawmakers panic. Dealers raise prices. It's the mid-1970s, and the evening news has turned into a horror anthology. Anchors with frozen smiles and perfectly coiffed hair stare into the camera, their voices low and urgent. "Good evening," they say, and tonight's top story, Angel Dust, the drug that makes ordinary people go insane. The footage cuts to flashing lights, a stretcher, Maybe a police officer shaking his head for dramatic effect. The message is clear. Somewhere out there, right now, someone's smoking a mystery powder and punching a refrigerator. At first, it's local. A few strange incidents in Los Angeles, a bizarre arrest in Baltimore, an emergency room story in Detroit. But the media loves patterns, and soon 3 separate events become a national epidemic. TV newsrooms smell blood or ratings, which are close enough. Anchors start using ominous words like pandemic, wave, and crisis. There's dramatic music, blurry police footage, and the occasional shot of confiscated powder under bad fluorescent lighting. Meanwhile, newspapers can't get enough of it. Angel dust. The drug of madness, one headline screams. Another warns, peace pills turn men into killers. It's part journalism, part ghost story. Reporters describe PCP users with inhuman strength, glowing eyes, and the ability to shrug off bullets. The details shift with every retelling. A man fights 6 cops. A woman walks through fire. A teenager lifts a car. Each story gets bigger, bolder, and less plausible. But facts are boring. Fear sells. You can almost picture the editorial meetings. A producer holds up a police report about a guy who ran naked through traffic shouting about Jesus. Another says, "Great, make it plural." Suddenly its drug epidemic sweeps city streets. The moral panic practically writes itself. Parents watching at home clutch their pearls or their children. The PTA holds emergency meetings about dust dangers. Schools start showing anti-drug films featuring teenagers in bell-bottoms melting down after one puff of mystery marijuana. Every public service announcement sounds like it was written by someone who once saw a cloud of smoke and called the fire department. And lawmakers, they love it. Nothing unites politicians like fear that looks good on television. Congressional hearings are held. Senators wag fingers. One speech calls PCP a chemical evil unmatched since the atomic bomb. That's an actual quote, as if the Manhattan Project had just switched to drug enforcement. Funding for anti-drug programs explodes. Budgets are approved for special police units, awareness campaigns, and after-school lectures, where a tired officer holds up a photo of a cigarette dipped in formaldehyde and says, "This could be your child." But the people who really benefit are the dealers. Every time the news says this is the most powerful drug on the streets, sales go up. Nothing sells like forbidden magic. Angel dust becomes the hot new product, and the myth grows with every broadcast. Dealers don't even have to exaggerate until the evening news is doing it for them. Some start branding their product with names like Super Dust and Rocket Fuel, as if they're running a marketing department instead of a crime ring. Meanwhile, police departments are quietly losing their minds too. The media keeps replaying footage of rampaging PCP users, but most of the actual cases involve disoriented people sitting in gutters, crying, or trying to hug lampposts. The real danger isn't superhuman strength, it's confusion and panic, often worsened by how terrified everyone else is of them. But no one wants nuance when panic gets ratings. Talk shows get in on the hysteria next. Daytime hosts invite experts who describe PCP as evil incarnate. Former addicts appear, dramatically telling stories that sound more biblical than medical. I looked in the mirror and saw Satan. The audience gasps. Somewhere, an executive nods and books a follow-up segment called Angel Dust, the Devil's Powder. Even Hollywood takes notes. Crime dramas start featuring PCP-fueled maniacs tearing through alleys, chased by cops with saxophone-heavy soundtracks. Every week, another episode ends with the same line, "It's the drugs, Frank. The drugs are killing this city." By the end of the decade, the myth of angel dust has officially joined Bigfoot and the Bermuda Triangle as one of America's favourite nightmares. The irony is that most people who tried PCP didn't go berserk. Many just had terrifying, disorienting trips and swore never to do it again. But those stories didn't make the 6 o'clock news. The calm reality couldn't compete with chaos. So the legend grew unchecked, inflated by cameras, headlines, and fear. And that's how PCP became something more than a drug. It became a cultural monster. A shape-shifting villain that embodied every American anxiety of the 1970s. The fear of lawlessness, of addiction, of losing control. The media didn't just report on it, they performed it. Every headline, every broadcast, every warning turned angel dust into a national bogeyman. Proof that the world really was going insane, one news segment at a time. By 1975, emergency rooms are flooded with people on PCP, some comatose, some talking to God, some trying to bite paramedics. Doctors have no antidote. They start using tranquilizers meant for large animals. Suddenly, the word restraint becomes very literal. If you walked into a major American hospital during the height of the angel dust years, you'd think you'd wandered onto the set of a supernatural thriller. The ERs were overflowing, not with overdoses in the traditional sense, but with chaos in human form. One man arrives handcuffed to a gurney, muttering about how he's trapped between worlds. Another bursts through the doors, insisting that his reflection is lying to him. There's a woman screaming that her skin is made of static electricity, and 3 paramedics nursing bite marks from her escape attempt. Doctors, normally calm under pressure, begin losing their cool. They've dealt with everything: gunshots, heart attacks, bad LSD trips, but nothing like this. PCP doesn't follow the rules. There's no neat dose-response curve, no predictable come-down. The body temperature spikes, then plummets. Pupils contract, then dilate. The mind dissolves. A patient might go from serene to feral in 10 seconds flat. One nurse describes it perfectly. It was like the lights were on, but reality wasn't home. And the worst part, there's no cure, no Narcan, no quick injection that pulls someone back. The only option is containment, so hospitals begin improvising. They pull out the heavy-duty sedatives usually reserved for aggressive psychiatric patients, or, when that fails, the veterinary-grade ones meant for tranquilizing livestock. The irony is hard to miss. The same chemical that started as an animal anesthetic now requires animal tranquilizers to undo it. Restraints become standard procedure. Not metaphorical restraints, actual leather straps, full body wraps, and handcuffs. Orderlies are trained to dodge kicks and bites while trying to inject patients through thrashing limbs. The scene is so intense that some hospitals begin assigning extra security to the ER overnight. In one Los Angeles hospital, they start keeping a crash cart labelled PCP right next to the defibrillator. Not for hearts, but for chaos. Paramedics bear the brunt of it. They're the first to arrive, the first to see what angel dust does to the human mind. Their radio chatter becomes almost mythic. Dispatch, we've got a male, mid-20s, thinks he's Jesus, trying to baptize himself in a pothole. Or, female, no clothes, believes she's flying, please advise. Advise what exactly? There's no handbook for divine delusion and self-inflicted flight testing. For the paramedics, survival depends on teamwork and luck. The dust calls, as they're known, are unpredictable. Some patients are docile, weeping, lost in hallucination. Others explode into violent motion without warning. Adrenaline floods every call, and by 1976 most EMTs can recognize the look, the glassy eyes, the slow-motion speech, the eerie calm before the storm. Inside the hospital, the situation gets worse before it gets better. PCP patients can stay dissociated for hours, sometimes days. Some wake up and have no memory of what they did. Others wake up screaming, mid-hallucination, convinced the doctors are government agents or devils. One ER physician later recalled, "It wasn't the patients who scared me. It was how unpredictable they were. You never knew when the person in front of you would stop being human and start being something else." Police officers begin accompanying ambulances to PCP calls, both for safety and because someone has to carry the suspect's handcuffs when the hospital inevitably cuts them off. Law enforcement starts keeping separate codes for PCP incidents. Dispatchers stop sounding surprised when disturbance calls turn into 6-person brawls inside a single apartment. For the first time, the national emergency system begins adapting to a chemical threat that doesn't kill people. It just turns them inside out. By 1978, The phrase PCP case becomes ER shorthand for get help. Entire night shifts are built around managing the waves of dust freakouts. The staff learns tricks to survive the chaos. Dim the lights, speak softly, never lie to the patient, they can sense it. One nurse, exhausted, tells a new recruit, "If you think you've seen crazy, you haven't seen PCP," and yet, amid all this madness, a strange empathy begins to grow among the hospital workers. After the panic fades and the sedatives wear off, they see the same faces, scared, confused, remorseful. Most aren't hardened criminals. They're ordinary people who took one bad hit trying to escape a worse life. And while the news calls them monsters, the ER staff sees something else. Lost souls caught in the crossfire between chemistry and despair. By the end of the decade, the 911 system itself has evolved around them. The drug that promised peace has created an infrastructure for emergency chaos, specialized training, safety protocols, and a new respect for just how far the human mind can drift when pushed by the wrong molecule. The era of calling for help has officially begun, and no one, not the doctors, not the cops, not even the patients, will ever see rescue the same way again. Police training manuals begin adding new sections titled Handling PCP Suspects. The advice? Stay calm, use multiple officers, and avoid eye contact. Because when someone's brain thinks they're a tank, pepper spray is just seasoning. By the mid to late 1970s, the American police force had a new boogeyman, and it wasn't organised crime, or even drugs in general. It was the angel dust incident. Every department had one. A routine call that turned into a surreal wrestling match with someone who seemed to have forgotten what human limits meant. The manuals called it excited delirium. The officers called it Tuesday. It's 1977 in Los Angeles. 2 patrolmen respond to a call about a man disturbing the peace. They arrive expecting a drunk or a domestic dispute. Instead, they find a shirtless guy in the street staring at the sky, completely motionless. They approach slowly, hands hovering near their holsters. Then, without warning, he roars. Not yells, roars, and charges headfirst into their squad car, cracking the windshield with his skull. When the officers try to restrain him, he doesn't stop. He doesn't even blink. It takes 5 people, 2 pairs of handcuffs, and a very confused paramedic to get him down. Later, the report simply reads, "Subject appeared to feel no pain." These encounters become so common that police academies start holding special seminars. Trainers stand before rooms of rookie officers and calmly say things like, "If you think they're down, they're not." They explain how PCP users might resist tasing, how they might break free from restraints, how they might continue fighting after being shot. Whether all of it is true or not doesn't matter. The fear spreads faster than the facts. Officers start approaching every erratic suspect like they're about to arm wrestle a demon. The truth is far less cinematic, but no less tragic. PCP doesn't make people invincible. It makes them numb to pain, to fear, to reason. Under its influence, someone can shatter their own bones without realizing it. They can run barefoot over glass and feel nothing until it's far too late. To an officer on the scene, that looks like superhuman strength. To the user, it's delusion and self-destruction in real time. The classic police tactics, shouts, threats, escalation, fail miserably. Verbal commands bounce off dissociated minds like pebbles off armour. Pepper spray barely registers. Batons and chokeholds only make things worse. When one person's brain says, "You are immortal," and another's says, "Stop resisting, someone's going to get hurt." And usually it's both of them. Officers start improvising. Some departments invest in capture nets, yes, like the kind used for wild animals. Others double up on manpower, sending entire squads to respond to one dust call. In Washington, D.C., police start requesting ambulances before even attempting an arrest, because by now, everyone knows how it ends. Broken furniture, bruised egos, and a suspect who either passes out cold or wakes up screaming. And still, the stories keep coming. A man fights off 4 cops and 2 dogs. A woman is hit with a baton and doesn't flinch. Someone runs naked through downtown traffic. Unharmed and inexplicably cheerful, these become legends whispered in locker rooms, growing more dramatic with each retelling. The line between caution and superstition blurs. Some veterans start carrying extra handcuffs. Others quietly admit they'd rather face an armed suspect than a dusted one. Of course, not all officers are villains in these stories. Many genuinely try to protect, to subdue without harm. But they're under-equipped, under-trained, and terrified. Every encounter feels like a test of endurance instead of law enforcement. One rookie later recalls, "It wasn't like dealing with a criminal. It was like dealing with a hurricane wearing pants." The chaos doesn't just affect police, it seeps into policy. Departments push for new gear, new tasers, heavier batons. Politicians promise crackdowns, funding militarization disguised as protection. The narrative of the unstoppable PCP user becomes justification for using overwhelming force. Fear becomes policy, and the myth becomes self-perpetuating. Behind every headline of man on angel dust dies after police struggle is the same tragic loop. A frightened officer, a delusional victim, and a system that mistakes panic for strength. The medical reports that follow always sound eerily similar. Massive adrenaline surges, dehydration, sometimes heart failure from restraint or exhaustion. But by the time the paperwork's filed, the legend has already outrun the truth, and still, the calls keep coming. A dispatcher's voice crackles through the radio. Possible PCP, male subject. No clothes. Every officer knows what that means. It's going to be a long night. Somewhere, someone's reality has dissolved, and the rest of the world is about to get dragged into the wreckage. By the end of the decade, dust calls are part of police folklore. They're swapped like war stories, half cautionary, half absurd. But underneath the bravado lies something simpler. Fear. Fear of what humans become when they lose the ability to feel pain, and fear of what society becomes when it stops trying to understand them. Because behind every wild-eyed suspect and every panicked officer was the same truth. Nobody was in control. Not the cops, not the doctors, not the dealers, not the users. Just chaos. Pure, chemical chaos, marching through the streets in human form. Behind the scenes, the chemists who invented PCP are horrified. They write internal memos begging Park Davis to destroy their formula. But the drug's already gone rogue, copied, cooked, and sold in alleys by people who couldn't spell phencyclidine if you paid them. It's the mid-1970s, and somewhere in a quiet corner of Michigan, a group of white-coated scientists sit in silence, watching the evening news. The anchor's voice is grim. Another angel dust incident. Police say the suspect fought off 4 officers before being subdued. The camera cuts to flashing lights and broken glass. In the reflection of the screen, one of the chemists mutters, "That's our compound." Nobody laughs. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In 1956, these men and women genuinely believed they were creating a medical miracle, a cleaner, safer anesthetic, something elegant and efficient. It had been born in glassware, not chaos, in the soft hiss of gas burners and the careful drip of solvents. But now, 20 years later, it's a household name for all the wrong reasons. Angel dust. The phrase alone makes them wince. It sounds poetic, almost divine, the opposite of what it really is. Inside Park Davis, internal memos start to circulate. The scientists, once proud of their creation, now plead with management to intervene. They argue that keeping the formula active in company archives is irresponsible. Some even propose destroying the research altogether, citing unacceptable social consequences. The higher-ups respond with cautious legal phrasing. "We are monitoring the situation." Corporate for, "We'd rather not get involved." The chemists begin keeping copies of their correspondence, little insurance policies in case history decides to assign blame. "We warned them," one memo reads. "We warned them it was unstable." And unstable it was, not just chemically, but morally. Because outside the lab, the synthesis instructions have leaked. The formula that once required a multi-million-dollar facility can now be recreated in a basement with enough determination and questionable ethics. And that's exactly what's happening. Across the country, garage chemists and small-time hustlers are trying their hand at homemade phencyclidine. The results are inconsistent. Some batches are relatively pure. Others contain mystery ingredients that could fuel a small rocket. In one infamous case, a batch of street PCP tests positive for brake cleaner. Another for embalming fluid, which in fairness some dealers actually advertise as a feature. For the chemists watching this unfold, it's like seeing their life's work held hostage by chaos. They see their molecule stripped of its context, no longer a medical tool, but a weapon of self-destruction. And they feel it personally. They were supposed to help people sleep through surgery, not sleepwalk through madness. One researcher writes privately, "We created a door, and people keep walking through it without coming back." The guilt starts to spread. Some leave the company entirely, retreating into quieter jobs, food chemistry, agricultural science, anything that doesn't make the news. Others stay, hoping to mitigate the damage, publishing papers about safer alternatives. A few try to reframe PCP's reputation in scientific journals, emphasizing its potential value in psychiatric research. It's a noble effort, but it's drowned out by tabloid headlines about superhuman dust freaks. In the boardroom, executives discuss damage control. Publicly, they insist PCP was discontinued for humans years ago. Privately, they're terrified of liability. The company lawyers make sure every future press release carefully avoids the word phencyclidine. Instead, they refer to it as a discontinued compound of historical note. It's corporate amnesia at its finest. If you don't say the name, maybe it'll vanish. But the scientists can't forget. They read the police reports, the medical studies, the ER case files. They recognize the pattern: dissociation, hallucination, panic, violence, despair. It's the same reaction they saw in the early trials, only multiplied by 1,000. What was once a medical curiosity is now a nationwide spectacle. Every headline feels like a personal failure. One of the original chemists, let's call him Dr. Lewis, gives an interview years later. He's old now, his voice soft but still tinged with disbelief. "We knew it was powerful," he says. "We didn't know it could break people." He pauses, then adds, "It was supposed to take away pain. I suppose it did." In the end, the formula survives, preserved in textbooks and lab databases. The warnings are clear, the dangers documented, but the myth is stronger. The scientist's creation has outgrown them, mutated into something unrecognizable. It no longer belongs to Park Davis. It belongs to the streets, to history, to the long list of human inventions that escaped their makers. And somewhere in a dusty laboratory archive, the original handwritten formula still sits, perfect, precise, and horrifyingly simple. A few lines of chemistry that changed everything. Proof that sometimes the most dangerous things in the world don't come from malice, but from curiosity. And that the road to hell really is paved with laboratory-grade intentions. In the mid-1970s, PCP becomes the drug of the underground club scene, smoked, snorted, or dipped on joints. Users call it getting wet. For about 10 minutes they float in bliss. Then the walls start breathing, and the night turns biblical. It begins innocently enough, or at least as innocently as anything involving homemade anesthetics can. The clubs of the mid-70s were already petri dishes for chemical creativity. Cocaine, quaaludes, LSD, and whatever new powder someone smuggled in a shoe. The lights were low, the music was loud, and the rules were soft. In the back corners of discos and converted warehouses, a new ritual takes hold. Someone dips a cigarette in a mystery vial, someone else lights it up, and for a few blissful minutes the crowd floats. The air smells like perfume, sweat, and danger. They called it getting wet. The idea was simple. Dip a joint or cigarette in liquid PCP, let it dry, and smoke it. A wet stick or sherm promised transcendence, or at least a night that felt longer than time itself. At first it was quiet, whispered, traded between friends. Then it became performance. People at house parties took hits and claimed they could see the music. One man swore he danced with his shadow for 3 straight hours. Another spent a whole night staring at a disco ball and describing the secrets of geometry. But the beauty of PCP is short-lived, and the crash is cinematic. Somewhere between the 10th minute and the 15th, reality comes apart at the seams. The floor starts to ripple like water. The walls pulse to the beat, and every glance feels like it's staring straight into your soul. People start laughing uncontrollably, or crying, or both. It's not fun anymore, it's biblical. Someone's on their knees praying. Someone else is trying to wrestle their own reflection. The DJ, unbothered, just keeps spinning. In New York's Lower East Side, PCP parties become infamous. Word spreads of angel dust dens, basements where the smoke hangs thick enough to taste. A few curious journalists sneak in, expecting the glamour of disco rebellion, and instead find people staring at walls, whispering about God. And it's not a drug, one user tells a reporter. It's a portal. He's not wrong, just underselling the horror. And yet, for every cautionary tale, there's another convert. Some swear the drug gives them peace, that it strips away fear and ego. For a brief, shimmering moment, it's nirvana. Then the lights flicker, and nirvana starts throwing furniture. Club owners begin banning PCP outright, not for moral reasons, but because it's bad for business when patrons start baptizing themselves in punch bowls. Outside the clubs, PCP parties evolve into something darker. Abandoned houses and parking lots become makeshift temples. The dust crowd, as police call them, gather in groups, passing dipped cigarettes in silence. The experience becomes communal, almost religious. Users describe sharing visions, walking through time, and meeting angels made of static. Others describe screaming. The line between enlightenment and psychosis becomes impossible to draw. Paramedics start recognizing the pattern. A call comes in from a party. The music still blaring in the background, and there's always at least one person who won't stop chanting, "I can't die." They arrive to find the aftermath, broken glass, dazed faces, and someone hugging a fire hydrant. The EMTs carry extra restraints, and sometimes a sense of humour. Angel dust, one mutters, should have called it demon breath. Meanwhile, the press catches wind of the phenomenon and turns it into spectacle. TV news airs grainy footage of angel dust parties with ominous narration. Young people are chasing euphoria and finding madness. Parents watch in horror. But for the youth already disillusioned with everything, that horror becomes part of the appeal. The forbidden always sells. As the drug spreads through disco culture, its effects mutate. Some users start mixing PCP with cocaine, heroin, or LSD, chasing highs that defy biology. The results are catastrophic. ER doctors call it chemical roulette. People arrive unresponsive, twitching, or catatonic. One nurse calls it the death stare, eyes wide open, no one home. The human brain, it turns out, doesn't appreciate being booted offline mid-party. By 1978, PCP is no longer just an underground indulgence. It's an epidemic with a dance beat. The angel dust parties fade, replaced by cautionary headlines and police raids. What began as a strange, euphoric rebellion ends in silence. The kind that only comes after too much noise. Looking back, it's easy to see the tragic poetry in it all. A generation desperate for connection, chasing transcendence through smoke and mirrors. They wanted to rise above pain, above reality itself. And for 10 fleeting minutes they did. Then the walls started breathing, the floor fell away, and the angels stopped singing. Psych wards start filling with long-term PCP users who never come back down. Some develop schizophrenia-like symptoms that never fade. Others simply disappear into institutions. For every sensational story about superhuman strength, there's a quiet tragedy no one reports. By the late 1970s, the headlines had moved on to cocaine cowboys and disco divas. But behind closed doors, in the forgotten corners of hospitals and state-run asylums, another story was unfolding, one without cameras, or music, or rescue. These were the people who didn't bounce back from their trip, the ones who never came home. For all the wild police chases and tabloid stories about rampaging dust heads, the real toll of PCP wasn't in the chaos of the streets. It was in the silence afterward. Many users came down from the highs dazed but intact. Others woke up changed, as if the door their mind had opened during the trip refused to shut again. They'd wander in and out of lucidity, haunted by voices, flashes of colour, or the belief that they were still floating. Doctors called it persistent psychosis. The patients called it the echo. You can picture the wards, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, nurses in starched uniforms pushing meal carts that smell faintly of bleach and mashed potatoes. In one corner a man sits perfectly still, staring at a blank wall as if it's showing him a movie only he can see. Across from him, a young woman hums softly, her fingers twitching to an invisible rhythm. Neither is violent, neither is superhuman. They're just gone. The psychiatrists who treated them were baffled. They'd seen bad acid trips, barbiturate overdoses, even methamphetamine psychosis. But PCP was different. It didn't just scramble perception, it seemed to rewrite identity. The drug blocked the brain's NMDA receptors, severing communication between neurons like someone cutting the power grid inside your skull. And for some unlucky users, that connection never fully restored itself. They weren't high anymore, they were stuck. In a 1978 study, researchers followed dozens of PCP users who'd been hospitalized after major episodes. Half recovered within days. The other half stayed symptomatic for months. Paranoia, catatonia, hallucinations that looped endlessly. One patient described living between worlds, unable to tell dreams from waking life. Another begged doctors to turn the air off because he swore it was talking to him. These were the forgotten victims, not dead, not alive, trapped in the liminal space between chemistry and consciousness, and society didn't know what to do with them. Most were quietly filed under chronic psychiatric disorder and institutionalized. Funding for long-term care was already evaporating by the end of the decade, so they drifted through underfunded facilities, places where fluorescent lights never turned off, where medication trays replaced conversation, and where the sound of television static became the lullaby of the lost. Their families, if they had any, stopped visiting after a while. What do you say to someone who looks like your son but believes he's light itself? Or to a daughter who spends her days talking to invisible angels, convinced she's been chosen to fix reality? These weren't cautionary tales for public service announcements. They didn't fit the media's script. There was no cinematic chaos, just the slow erosion of human consciousness, one neuron at a time. For every man on PCP Attack 6 Cops headline, there were hundreds of quiet fates that never made the paper. Young people who tried a dip, a pill, a puff, and fell through the cracks forever. No police lights, no reporters, no sympathy. Just empty rooms, white walls, and the steady hum of a drug that refused to leave. Doctors tried to learn from it. Some began using PCP's psychological effects as a model for studying schizophrenia. They discovered eerie similarities, delusions, auditory hallucinations, emotional flatness. In a dark twist of irony, the very compound that destroyed minds helped researchers understand mental illness better. But for the people already lost, that was small comfort. You can't publish someone's sanity back into existence. By 1980, the public had stopped paying attention. The panic had moved on. But the asylums were still full, living monuments to a decade that promised peace through chemistry and delivered confusion instead. PCP wasn't just a drug problem, it was a human one. A mirror showing how easily people chasing escape can become the very thing society chooses not to see. So while the newspapers screamed about monsters on angel dust, the real horror sat quietly in hospital beds, whispering to ceilings, forgotten by the same world that once called them invincible. And somewhere in those endless hallways, under flickering fluorescent light, you can still hear the faint echo of what they were trying to do, not destroy themselves, but disappear from a reality that had already stopped making sense. By 1978, politicians find their new villain. Angel Dust becomes the poster child of the war on drugs, terrifying, unpredictable, and perfect for campaign speeches. The DEA cracks down, but the drug's already baked into pop culture. It's an election year and the country is exhausted. The Vietnam hangover hasn't lifted, crime is up, inflation is eating paychecks, and disco is starting to sound like a cry for help. So when television networks start showing footage of people running naked through traffic on something called angel dust, politicians see opportunity. Fear, after all, polls extremely well. They call press conferences in front of microphones and American flags. The tone is grave, the message simple. We are losing our children to drugs. Of course, what they really mean is we are losing votes to apathy. But it doesn't matter. The cameras love them. PCP becomes Exhibit A in America's latest moral panic. A perfect enemy because it's invisible, chemical, and vaguely supernatural. The sound bites practically write themselves. It gives people superhuman strength. It makes men into monsters. It could happen in your neighborhood. The DEA, newly invigorated after the Nixon years, swings into action. Raids begin across the country. Lab busts in LA, undercover stings in DC, seizures in Texas and Miami. Agents pose for photos beside stacks of confiscated powder like big game hunters showing off a kill. But behind the tough talk, the truth is embarrassing. PCP was never a centralized operation. There were no kingpins, no cartels, just thousands of amateur chemists cooking the drug in garages, basements, and abandoned motels. You couldn't wage a traditional war on it, because there was no enemy, just fumes, paranoia, and a bad idea that refused to die. Still, the headlines keep coming. Angel Dust, America's chemical nightmare. Demon drug invades our schools. Teenage girl smokes. PCP thinks she's a lizard. The more absurd the story, the more airtime it gets. Lawmakers quote them in speeches, cable networks dramatize them in special reports, and every parent in America goes to bed picturing their kid biting a mailman. Behind the scenes, the crackdown gets messy. In the rush to show results, police start sweeping entire neighborhoods. Young people, especially in poor urban areas, are arrested not for selling PCP, but for looking like someone who might. Bags of oregano and aspirin become suspected narcotics. The prisons fill up fast. The system, always hungry for new bodies, finds its meal ticket in the war on drugs, and PCP, with its flashy horror stories, is the perfect appetizer. By 1980, the rhetoric reaches fever pitch. President Carter's administration quietly passes tougher sentencing laws, and state legislatures follow suit. California declares PCP public enemy number 1. Federal funding pours into anti-drug campaigns. Schools show terrifying PSA videos featuring teenagers jumping out of windows or clawing at their faces. The narrator's voice is always the same, deep, stern, vaguely disappointed. This could be your child. Meanwhile, the actual problem isn't getting better. PCP use doesn't disappear, it just gets quieter. The drug moves from clubs and street corners into smaller, poorer communities, the ones no one films. The users still hallucinate, still lose themselves, but now they do it out of sight, in the shadows left by the cameras. The war isn't stopping the fire, it's just driving it underground. And yet, in a strange twist, all the panic makes PCP immortal. It becomes a cultural touchstone, referenced in TV shows, rap lyrics, and late-night comedy monologues. The drug is now legend, its effects exaggerated into myth. For a generation raised on anti-drug propaganda, angel dust is less a narcotic than a ghost story, something you whisper about at parties to prove you've heard the tales. In one sense, the politicians get what they want. The angel dust menace becomes proof that they're protecting America. Their speeches sound heroic, their polls climb, But the real victims, the users, the addicts, the communities gutted by mass incarceration, are left behind, nameless and voiceless. The war on drugs isn't fought on battlefields, it's fought in living rooms, on street corners, in overcrowded jails. And the casualties aren't chemical, they're human. By the end of the 1970s, the hysteria has peaked. PCP is officially outlawed in all forms, its possession carrying heavy penalties, but the damage is done. The myth of angel dust has already outgrown reality, feeding a machine that will soon come for cocaine, crack, heroin, ecstasy, and anything else that can be branded the next epidemic. The war on drugs didn't kill PCP, it made it famous, a household name, a bogeyman, the perfect chemical villain in a story America keeps telling itself, that evil can be outlawed, that fear can be legislated, and that you can fight despair with punishment. But in the quiet corners of cities across the country, the real war, the one for empathy, understanding, and healing, hasn't even begun. Funk, soul, and punk bands start writing about PCP, not out of glamour, but horror. Songs like White Lines and Disco Inferno aren't just catchy, they're cautionary tales set to a bass line. Even Parliament warns, don't fake the funk on a nasty bump. By the late 1970s, America's dance floors had turned into battlefields of sound, sweat, and chemical experimentation. The clubs were alive, and so was the paranoia. Under the neon haze of disco lights and cigarette smoke, music became both a soundtrack and a survival guide. For every glitter-covered reveller chasing euphoria, there was a song on the radio quietly reminding them that euphoria had an expiration date. Funk, soul, and punk, three genres that rarely agreed on anything, found common ground in a single truth. Drugs had stopped being cool. PCP, especially, had stripped the romance out of intoxication. It wasn't poetic like LSD or glamorous like cocaine. It was unpredictable, dirty, and terrifying. You didn't trip on PCP, you vanished. Musicians, many of whom had seen it up close, decided someone had to say something, even if they had to say it with a groove. Funk was first to take a swing. Bands like Parliament Funkadelic and the Ohio Players started sneaking anti-PCP warnings into their lyrics. Their shows were a mix of electric chaos and thinly veiled sermons about the dangers of bad chemistry. George Clinton, high priest of funk and veteran of nearly every substance known to man, started calling out angel dust by name during performances. "Stay clean, stay funky," he'd shout into the mic, his glittering robe swaying under the lights. And the crowd, half laughing, half nodding, knew he wasn't joking. They'd seen what happened when people tried to fake the funk on a nasty bump. Meanwhile, in the smoky back rooms of recording studios, musicians traded horror stories. A drummer who thought his arms were melting mid-gig, a backup singer who vanished for 3 days after getting wet, a saxophonist who walked into a wall and apologized to it. Everyone knew someone who'd lost their mind to angel dust, and everyone was a little scared that, one night, it might be them. In New York and LA, the punk scene was equally disillusioned. For punk bands, PCP wasn't a chemical escape. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Songs screamed about government control, pharmaceutical greed, and the moral collapse of the suburbs. The Ramones mocked the hysteria. The Dead Kennedys turned it into satire. The message was clear. If the establishment was handing out nightmares, the kids would at least make noise about it. Then there was disco, glitzy, excessive, and hopelessly in denial. While most of the scene was fueled by cocaine and hedonism, PCP occasionally crept into the mix like a curse. Some partygoers mistook it for a new kind of high and learned quickly that it wasn't made for dancing. DJs started whispering warnings between tracks, club owners banned wet sticks, and performers like Donna Summer and Earth, Wind and Fire began weaving moral messages into their music. Disco Inferno, originally about passion and energy, took on a darker undertone when real inferno started breaking out in clubs full of dusted-out patrons. Behind the glamour, the industry itself was unraveling. Record execs and promoters had spent the 60s glorifying drug culture, but now it was eating their talent alive. Studios became triage centres for musicians who couldn't tell the difference between art and addiction. Engineers kept Narcan next to their mixing boards. Managers whispered the phrase, "dust problem," the same way one might whisper affair. And yet, out of the chaos came some of the most honest music of the decade. Songs stopped pretending that drugs were gateways to enlightenment and started admitting they were just doors, and not all doors led somewhere worth going. Even the upbeat anthems carried warnings hidden beneath the rhythm. White Lines, despite being about cocaine, echoed the panic surrounding PCP, vision dreams of passion / going through my mind. It wasn't about joy, it was about compulsion. The same compulsion that sent people chasing highs they couldn't afford to come down from. For the musicians who survived that era, PCP became a metaphor for the industry itself. Intoxicating, powerful, and capable of eating you alive. The ones who lived through it wore their scars like badges. The ones who didn't became legends. By the time the 1980s arrived, the message was clear. The party was over. The music was still loud, but the lyrics had turned cynical, reflective, and weary. Funk had become a sermon. Punk had become a warning. And disco, well, disco had burned out completely, a victim of its own excess. But in the ruins of the dance floor, one truth still echoed from every beat, every riff, every trembling lyric. No matter how good the rhythm, you can't outdance a drug that turns reality inside out. The music could save your soul, but only if you were still around to hear the final note. In movies, PCP becomes shorthand for madness. Characters on angel dust punch through cars, scream at clouds, and dance into traffic. Every B-movie villain in the 80s is suddenly on PCP, even when it's clearly just caffeine and bad acting. By the time the 1980s rolled in, America had officially replaced disco balls with paranoia. The news had turned angel dust into the boogeyman. Politicians had built careers on it, and now Hollywood wanted its piece of the fear. The result? A decade of film and television where every act of chaos, every fistfight, every random burst of energy could be explained with 3 simple letters. PCP. It started in crime dramas. The camera pans over flashing police lights. The soundtrack hums with synthesized tension, and an officer says the line that became a cliché for a generation. He must be on PCP. It didn't matter if the suspect was just sweaty, nervous, or holding a crowbar. That phrase instantly made sense of everything. The magic of film turning pharmacology into plot device. Movies from this era treated angel dust like a kind of demonic possession. Characters smoked a mystery cigarette, their pupils dilated, and suddenly they were sprinting through windshields or growling like wild animals. Low-budget directors loved it because it required no special effects, just an actor willing to flail dramatically and scream. It was chaos on a budget. One of the earliest examples was the 1981 cop thriller Vice Squad, which featured a suspect so hopped up on PCP he seemed to have lost touch with gravity. Then came Colours, 1988, Death Wish 2, 1982, and dozens of other gritty, neon-lit crime flicks that made angel dust the invisible villain. If something violent, inexplicable, or slightly sweaty happened on screen, the audience didn't need backstory. They just needed the word PCP, and boom, instant justification. And Hollywood didn't stop at crime dramas. Even sitcoms got in on the hysteria. In the 80s, nearly every popular show had a very special episode about drugs. Usually it was cocaine or marijuana, but occasionally a brave scriptwriter would reach for the heavy artillery. A side character, maybe the lovable goofball or the misunderstood teen, would experiment with angel dust and instantly turn into a hurricane of poor decisions. Cue the dramatic music, the slow pan, and the parental monologue about choices. But behind the melodrama, Hollywood's depiction of PCP was doing what Hollywood always does best, taking fear and making it entertaining. The industry understood something the DEA didn't, that Americans didn't just want to be safe, they wanted to watch danger happen to someone else. So PCP became a cinematic monster, a stand-in for everything society couldn't explain. It wasn't about drugs anymore, it was about control. Even horror movies got in on the act. Angel dust became the scientific explanation for any supernatural behaviour that wasn't actually supernatural. Someone levitates, PCP. Someone crawls out a window claiming they're a bird, definitely PCP. Demons are passé, chemically induced madness is modern. Films like Angel Dusted, 1981, a made-for-TV drama starring Gene Stapleton, portrayed PCP as the devil in powder form. The tagline practically wrote itself, one hit and you'll never be the same. Of course the irony was that Hollywood was full of actual drug use. Coke lines on glass tables, whiskey-fueled rewrites, and all-night editing sessions powered by substances that could make PCP look quaint. But hypocrisy is part of the showbiz diet. On-screen, PCP was a villain. Off-screen, it was a punchline at after-parties. Still, the movies left a mark. They cemented PCP's reputation in the public imagination as something almost supernatural, a chemical that could transform a person into a monster. Parents who never even saw the drug in real life could quote movie scenes about it. Kids who'd never touched it could describe its effects in detail, thanks to reruns and late-night cable. Pop culture had turned a complex neurochemical phenomenon into slapstick horror. The funniest or saddest part is how wildly inaccurate it all was. Real PCP users weren't demonic. They were often terrified, confused and disoriented. The super strength wasn't invincibility, it was adrenaline and dissociation. But movies don't like nuance. Terrified and confused doesn't sell popcorn. Unstoppable Rage Machine does. So the myth persisted, replayed over and over until even the police started believing Hollywood's version more than their own reports. By the end of the decade, Angel Dust had fully migrated from lab to legend. It was no longer a drug people actually feared using. It was a trope, a narrative shortcut. Whenever a screenwriter needed chaos without context, they wrote in PCP. It was the Swiss Army knife of lazy storytelling, and the audience, already conditioned by years of news hysteria, accepted it without question. Looking back, it's almost poetic. A drug that numbs emotion and severs reality became the perfect metaphor for the decade that used it. Glamorous, hysterical, and disconnected, Hollywood didn't invent PCP's madness. It just learned how to film it. And for a brief, glittering moment, everyone was high on the same thing. Fear, flickering on a screen, disguised as entertainment. By the early 1980s, news stories claim angel dust is showing up in high schools, playgrounds, even Halloween candy. It's mostly urban legend, but that doesn't stop PTA meetings from turning into full-scale moral panics with PowerPoint slides. The suburbs, those carefully curated utopias of trimmed lawns and cul-de-sacs, had survived the counterculture, the energy crisis, and disco. But nothing rattled them quite like the rumour that drugs had made it past the white picket fences. It didn't matter that most PCP production was happening in urban centres hundreds of miles away. The myth had already done its job. It whispered into the quiet comfort of suburbia. Your children aren't safe. The panic begins the way all great American myths do, with a headline, "Angel dust found in Halloween candy," screams one local paper, citing a single unverified police report from somewhere in New Jersey. Within days, it's being discussed on morning shows across the country. Anchors clutch their cue cards, brows furrowed in performative concern. What's really hiding in your kid's trick-or-treat bag? Viewers sip coffee, horrified, while kids just wonder why everyone's suddenly inspecting their Reese's cups with a magnifying glass. Before long, school districts are organising drug awareness nights, complete with folding chairs, overhead projectors, and a man in a brown polyester suit holding up a Ziploc bag of oregano. Parents nod gravely. That's how it starts, he says, as though backyard herbs are a gateway to chemical warfare. PTA presidents print flyers warning of angel dust-lace bubblegum and PCP joints disguised as candy cigarettes. Nobody questions how unlikely it is. Logic has left the building, replaced by the adrenaline rush of fear. One particularly panicked suburb in Ohio holds an emergency town hall. A detective solemnly explains that drug dealers are targeting children by soaking dollar bills in PCP and handing them out near playgrounds. Why? Someone asks. He shrugs. To get them hooked. The crowd gasps. Never mind that PCP users often spend their high thinking they can fly. Not exactly a sound business model for repeat customers. Meanwhile, television networks feed the hysteria. Talk shows bring in experts, sometimes police officers, sometimes self-proclaimed drug counsellors, to describe the horrors of angel dust in the most theatrical terms possible. One hit, they warn, and your child could think he's Superman and jump off the roof. It's gripping television, terrifying parenting, and absolute nonsense. But that's the secret ingredient to every moral panic. The less evidence, the better the story. Kids, of course, pick up on the absurdity faster than the adults. High schoolers start using angel dust as a punchline. Don't eat the cafeteria meatloaf, one says. It's laced with PCP. Parents don't find it funny. They double down, installing curfews, banning certain songs, and giving side-eye to anyone wearing sunglasses indoors. For a generation that grew up fearing communists and razor blades in apples, this new chemical boogeyman fits right in. The irony is that most suburban teens experimenting with drugs in the 1980s weren't anywhere near PCP. They were drinking beer stolen from their dad's fridge or sneaking joints behind the garage. But angel dust was exotic, theatrical, the kind of drug that made sense in the movie version of Danger. It gave parents a villain to fight, and nothing unites a community like a shared delusion. Then came the educational materials. School assemblies showed grainy VHS tapes featuring trembling teenagers, warning their classmates about the horrors of angel dust. One infamous video, Dust the Deadly High, depicted a boy smoking a laced joint, then immediately attacking his mother with a lamp. Teachers made students watch it twice. Somewhere in the back row someone whispered, "That's not how it works," and got detention for mocking safety messaging. By now, angel dust had become shorthand for everything terrifying and vaguely rebellious. Parents used it as a catch-all term for any unknown drug, while news anchors used it as moral punctuation. And remember, this could be happening in your neighbourhood. The words hung heavy in the air, a national lullaby of anxiety. Of course, the scare was never really about PCP. It was about control, about the illusion that suburban life could be kept spotless if people just worried hard enough. Angel dust became a metaphor for everything lurking beyond the fence line. Youth rebellion, social decay, the fear that maybe the world wasn't as safe or simple as it seemed in the brochures. And so, for a few years, parents fought a war that never existed. They swapped rumours, hosted seminars, and stared suspiciously at Halloween candy until the next national panic arrived. By the mid-1980s, crack cocaine stole the headlines, and angel dust quietly retreated into the background. But the damage was done. An entire generation of parents learned to fear shadows and to teach their children that the greatest threat wasn't what they saw, but what they imagined. And somewhere, in a quiet cul-de-sac, a dad still checks his kid's Snickers bar every October, just in case the 1980s decide to come back. Law enforcement starts collecting data. Turns out, most people on PCP aren't violent. They're terrified. The drug's superhuman effects are often adrenaline and pain suppression mixed with delusion. But by then, the myth is stronger than the molecule. By the early 1980s, after a decade of chaos, police departments begin doing something they hadn't tried before, keeping track, reports, body temperatures, response times, injuries, recovery patterns, the kind of paperwork that separates science from superstition. And what they discover shakes the foundations of the angel dust legend. The truth is simple and sad. The people high on PCP weren't monsters, they were scared. Completely detached from their bodies, hallucinating sounds and shapes that didn't exist, convinced they were dying or being hunted. Their so-called super strength wasn't some mutation, it was biology. The human body in survival mode, fueled by adrenaline and stripped of its pain sensors. When you can't feel broken ribs or lacerations, you can keep fighting long after you should have stopped. It wasn't demonic possession. It was physiology doing its best under terrible circumstances, but try telling that to the public. The myth of the unstoppable PCP user had become too convenient. For the news, for politicians, and even for the police. It explained everything they couldn't control. Violence, PCP, panic, PCP, a naked man in traffic, definitely PCP. The drug had turned into a universal scapegoat, the chemical version of bad vibes. Still, a few scientists and progressive police chiefs start digging deeper. The Los Angeles Police Department partners with psychiatrists and ER doctors to study real case outcomes. What they find is grim, but not what anyone expected. Most PCP-related deaths don't come from the drug itself. They come from fear, from dehydration, overheating, restraint complications, and sometimes sheer exhaustion after long, brutal confrontations. PCP doesn't kill the body directly. It kills it by making the mind forget how to stop. And for every headline about a PCP-crazed maniac, there are 100 reports of users found curled in corners, weeping, begging for someone to tell them if they're real. The myth of rage hides the reality of terror. People on PCP aren't fighting others, they're fighting to wake up. This shift in understanding sparks an internal divide within law enforcement. Some officers, hardened by years on the beat, don't buy it. They've seen the chaos, the broken windows, the bruises. They don't want to hear that what they're fighting is fear. But others, the ones who've held someone through a hallucination or watched them sob when the high breaks, start to get it. These aren't monsters. They're casualties of chemistry. Training programs begin to change, slowly. Police academies add short modules on chemical dissociation, explaining that PCP suppresses pain, not morality. They teach new recruits to stay calm, to keep their distance, to talk instead of yell. It's progress. Small, fragile progress. But on the streets, old habits die hard. When someone's screaming nonsense and swinging wildly, the instinct isn't empathy, it's survival. And so the cycle continues. The science grows clearer, but the fear stays louder. The phrase PCP suspect remains police shorthand for prepare for chaos. Dispatchers still warn, be careful, they might be on dust. Even when the data shows otherwise, fear keeps winning. Because fear has better PR. The scientists, meanwhile, keep publishing papers. One landmark study in 1983 debunks the myth entirely. PCP doesn't create rage, it creates confusion and detachment. Most violent incidents occur not because the drug causes aggression, but because users are confronted, restrained, or terrified into defending themselves. In other words, it's not the PCP doing the fighting, it's the panic. The results are quietly revolutionary, but they never make the evening news. No one wants to hear that the superhuman drug was really just a mirror reflecting human vulnerability. The public wants villains, not neurochemistry. A few departments take the findings seriously. They train officers to use cooling blankets instead of batons, sedatives instead of chokeholds. The results are striking. Fewer injuries, fewer deaths, more recoveries. But change doesn't come cheap or fast, and for every department adopting compassion, another doubles down on armour and intimidation. It's easier to fund fear than understanding. And so the myth endures, even as the data piles up. Decades later, when someone on the news does something inexplicable, the old refrain still pops up. Must have been on PCP. It's muscle memory now, cultural shorthand for chaos. In the end, the police science of PCP proves what every good horror story eventually does. The real monster was never the creature, it was the misunderstanding. The drug didn't create superhumans, it created illusions. And in chasing those illusions, society revealed something about itself, that sometimes it's easier to battle imaginary demons than to face the fragile, frightened humans standing right in front of us. Park Davis, once proud inventor, now pretends PCP never happened. Cernulan vanishes from veterinary catalogues. Company reps dodge questions like guilty alchemists. It's the corporate equivalent of erasing your browser history. It's 1980, and inside Park Davis headquarters in Michigan, the mood is grim. The company that once touted itself as a pioneer of modern medicine now finds itself haunted by a molecule it can't quite bury. Phencyclidine, the chemical miracle turned moral disaster, has officially become a forbidden word. In boardrooms once filled with talk of innovation and progress, there's only silence and legal disclaimers. For decades, Park Davis had been an icon of pharmaceutical optimism. They made the drugs that saved lives, eased pain, and helped modernize hospitals. Then came PCP, their own Frankenstein's monster. What began as an elegant anesthetic ended up being blamed for riots, psychosis, and naked people running through intersections. The company had tried to repurpose it, rename it, and rebrand it, but there's only so much lipstick you can put on a chemical that makes someone punch through drywall for fun. Internally, the staff call it the project that shall not be named. Officially, it's referred to only by catalogue number 10527. Even the memos avoid saying phencyclidine. The drug has gone from product to problem to PR nightmare. Executives hold quiet meetings to discuss how to minimize their connection to it. Marketing destroys old pamphlets. Research files are sealed. The corporate archives become a graveyard of shredded paper and nervous laughter. The final straw comes when Cernulan, PCP's veterinary version, starts getting stolen from animal clinics. Police raids link the stolen bottles to street labs producing angel dust. Each batch carries Park Davis's original label. That's when headquarters realizes it's over. The line between legitimate medicine and illicit chaos has disappeared completely. Within months, they pull the product from the market. Cernulan quietly disappears from catalogues, veterinary shelves, and existence. The only trace left is in a few old manuals, a footnote that reads, "Discontinued due to safety concerns." Translation: we'd like to pretend this never existed, but pretending is hard when the evidence keeps making headlines. Every time a new PCP rampage hits the evening news, someone inevitably mentions that the drug originated from a respected pharmaceutical company. For Park Davis, it's like being reminded of your worst ex every time you turn on the TV. The PR department goes into full damage control. Reporters who ask questions about Cernulan are given polite, empty statements. We discontinued that compound years ago. Behind closed doors, lawyers whisper words like liability and class action. Meanwhile, former employees can't help but feel conflicted. The scientists who first developed PCP remember the optimism, the pride, the thrill of discovery. They had genuinely believed they were advancing medicine, and they did, for about 5 minutes, before humanity started smoking it on purpose. Some of them go on record years later, their tone a mix of guilt and disbelief. It worked perfectly as an anesthetic, one researcher recalls. It's just that it also detached you from reality. We underestimated how much people wanted that. As the 80s roll on, Park Davis does everything it can to reinvent itself. It launches safer drugs, more socially acceptable ones, antibiotics, pain relievers, antidepressants. But deep in the archives, a ghost lingers. Corporate historians quietly skip the years between 1956 and 1979, like a family member skipping over the relative who moved abroad. The company's slogan changes, the logo modernizes, and yet the molecule remains, a phantom chemical with a life of its own. By the mid-1980s, the brand has successfully distanced itself from the scandal. Doctors no longer associate PCP with Park Davis. They associate it with chaos. It's a perverse kind of success. The company's shame is now public property. The streets own it, the police own it, Hollywood owns it. The scientist who made it, forgotten. Still, behind the scenes, the fallout leaves scars. Research funding tightens. An internal audit quietly concludes that risk assessment practices must be strengthened. Translation: we should stop inventing drugs that make people hallucinate their skeletons. Pharmaceutical innovation becomes cautious, almost timid. Where the post-war decades had been an age of wild chemical experimentation, the 80s usher in a new era of corporate paranoia. Every compound comes with 1,000 disclaimers, every press release with 3 lawyers. And that's how Park Davis, once the proud temple of progress, ends up living in quiet denial of its most infamous creation. There's no press conference, no apology, no admission of guilt, just silence. The company moves on, gets absorbed into Warner Lambert and later Pfizer. The name remains, but the legacy has been scrubbed clean. PCP becomes someone else's problem, someone else's cautionary tale. In the end, the empire doesn't collapse with a bang. It dissolves with a shrug. The company that gave the world a window into the human mind also gave it a mirror and didn't like what it saw. And so, like a guilty alchemist hiding his cursed invention, Park Davis simply closes the lab door and walks away, leaving behind a chemical that will outlive them all. By the 1990s, researchers begin studying PCP again, not as a party drug, but as a model for schizophrenia. The same hallucinations that ruined lives might help explain the human mind. Science has a strange sense of humour. It's the great irony of medicine. What once terrified society eventually ends up back under a microscope. After 2 decades of chaos, arrests and moral panic, PCP, the chemical pariah, is suddenly fashionable again in the halls of neuroscience. This time the lab coats are back on. The safety goggles are secure, and the word recreational is spoken only in whispers. The logic is simple but fascinating. PCP doesn't just make people hallucinate, it disrupts perception itself. It doesn't cloud the senses like alcohol or heighten them like stimulants. It rewires them, forcing the brain to experience reality out of sync. And that, researchers realize, looks eerily similar to schizophrenia. The detachment, the paranoia, the auditory hallucinations, the sudden loss of identity, all of it mirrors the symptoms doctors had been trying to understand for decades. In other words, PCP, the very chemical that destroyed lives, might hold the key to understanding how consciousness itself can shatter. And so, after years of police reports and headlines about superhuman rampages, the molecule returns to the lab under new management. Gone are the disco lights and smoke-filled basements. Now it's sterile white walls, PET scanners, and ethical review boards. Neuroscientists at Yale, Harvard, and the National Institute of Mental Health begin administering microdoses of PCP to volunteers under strict supervision to study how it alters brain chemistry. Some subjects report dissociation and anxiety. Others describe profound detachment, as if observing their thoughts from the outside. Researchers take notes, fascinated. For them, this isn't horror, it's data. The key discovery comes when scientists map PCP's interaction with NMDA receptors, a critical component in the brain's glutamate system. These receptors help regulate memory, emotion, and cognition, essentially the architecture of reality as we experience it. PCP blocks them, like jamming chewing gum into the circuits of consciousness. The result? The brain keeps running, but none of its parts are talking to each other. You're awake, but disconnected from yourself. This discovery changes everything. It suggests that schizophrenia, long blamed on dopamine alone, might also involve glutamate dysfunction, a new frontier for psychiatry. The irony is delicious. The same compound once used as an excuse for police brutality and tabloid hysteria is now helping scientists map the human psyche. The molecule goes from devil dust to diagnostic tool in a single generation. Of course, The work is controversial. Critics argue that reintroducing PCP to research is like inviting a wild animal back into the house. Even in microdoses, the effects are unpredictable. Some test subjects panic. A few experience lingering detachment that lasts for days. But for neuroscientists obsessed with understanding consciousness, it's worth the risk. We have to learn from our monsters, one researcher famously says. Even Frankenstein's creature taught us something about its creator. Throughout the 1990s, academic papers pour out with titles like phencyclidine as a model of psychosis and NMDA antagonists, and the mechanisms of reality perception. It's dry reading, full of charts and brain scans, but the implications are revolutionary. The research helps pave the way for new generations of antipsychotic medications, ones that target glutamate instead of dopamine. In a strange twist, PCP, the molecule once synonymous with chaos, becomes a blueprint for healing. Meanwhile, the public barely notices. The world has moved on to new drug panics: ecstasy, meth, crack cocaine. PCP is yesterday's nightmare. But in fluorescent-lit labs across the world, scientists are quietly resurrecting it, not to destroy, but to understand. It's a small act of redemption, though no one calls it that. The same molecule that once drove people to paranoia is now helping explain why paranoia happens. The same dissociation that terrified users is now being mapped, neuron by neuron, to uncover how consciousness stays tethered to the body. Science, as it turns out, doesn't have morals. It only has curiosity. By the end of the decade, PCP has a new title: the schizophrenia model drug. It's no longer the villain, it's a teacher. Researchers talk about it with respect, even reverence. They use words like instrumental and paradigmatic. You can almost hear the ghost of Park Davis sighing with relief. The monster, it seems, has been tamed, or at least invited back to the lab with supervision. And yet there's something haunting in that redemption arc. The same compound that once symbolized human recklessness is now the key to understanding it. The same chemical that made people lose their minds might one day help save them. It's poetic in a slightly unsettling way. Proof that progress often grows from the wreckage of our mistakes. So as the 1990s fade into the millennium, PCP finds a strange new identity. Not a party drug, not a public menace, but a quiet ally in the search for self-awareness. The lab coats have reclaimed the monster, not to kill it, but to learn from it, and in doing so, they've reminded the world of an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the line between madness and discovery is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Even decades later, PCP still haunts pop culture. Stories of the naked guy on angel dust who took 6 tasers resurface every few years. Most are exaggerations, but they tap into something ancient, our fear of losing control. The 2000s should have been the decade PCP finally faded into obscurity, a footnote in the long, strange story of America's war on drugs. Cocaine had Wall Street, ecstasy had the rave scene, meth had entire TV shows. Angel dust was supposed to be history. But every few years, like clockwork, it reappeared, not in the labs, but in headlines, whispered stories, and internet forums full of people saying, "No, dude, I saw it happen." It usually starts the same way. A viral news clip, a police report, or grainy footage from a dash cam. Somewhere someone does something inexplicable, breaks through handcuffs, shrugs off pepper spray, screams at the sky, and within hours, the story acquires its own mythology. He was on PCP, people say, as if that explains everything. It doesn't matter if toxicology reports later show nothing of the sort. Once a story sounds good, it stops needing facts. The myths are always the same shape, even as the names change. A man runs naked through traffic and lifts a car off the ground. A woman on angel dust jumps out of a third-story window and walks away unharmed. A teenager on PCP rips out his own IV and tries to fight a vending machine because it owed him change. They're urban fables of modern times, stories about power, chaos, and the thin line between humanity and madness. There's a reason these tales stick. On some level, they're comforting. They give form to something that terrifies everyone. The idea of losing control of your own mind. We like to imagine that the human psyche has limits, that our thoughts belong to us, that the body obeys reason. PCP stories shatter that illusion. They turn people into something unrecognizable, and then back again, as if to remind us that sanity is only ever rented, not owned. Cops, EMTs, and ER doctors all have their own version of the myth. Ask a veteran paramedic and they'll swear they once treated a man on PCP who snapped handcuffs like they were paper clips. Ask a cop and they'll tell you about a suspect who walked through a glass door without bleeding. Are the stories true? Sometimes. But more often, they're exaggerations of adrenaline, memory and fear, people trying to make sense of behaviour that defies their training. After all, what do you call someone who feels no pain and acts like they're invincible? Superhuman is easier than neurologically dissociated. By the 2010s, the internet gives these tales a second life. Message boards, Reddit threads, and YouTube comments fill with accounts of my cousin's friend on angel dust, who wrestled 3 officers or thought he could breathe underwater. They spread like modern folklore, part cautionary tale, part entertainment. The drug itself is rarely seen anymore, but its legend thrives. Like Bigfoot, it doesn't need to be real. It just needs to be believed in. What's fascinating is how the myth of PCP merges with newer panics. Every few years, a new substance gets blamed for the same behaviour. Flakka, bath salts, synthetic marijuana, all inherit the angel dust legacy. He must be on something becomes a national reflex. It's not really about the drug anymore. It's about explaining the unexplainable. The myth mutates, but the fear stays the same. In many ways, these stories outlived the actual epidemic because they serve a psychological purpose. They let us externalize madness. If someone does something violent, erratic, or bizarre, it's easier to say drugs did it than to confront the uncomfortable truth that the human brain is capable of breaking all on its own. The myth is a firewall between normality and chaos, between us and them. Even now, police reports still occasionally cite possible PCP influence when describing suspects who resist arrest or behave erratically, even before toxicology comes back. The phrase carries weight like a ghost of the 1970s haunting the paperwork. In court, defense attorneys still use it too, the PCP defense, shorthand for temporary insanity with chemical assistance. The legend may not hold up scientifically, but it still has cultural power. Every generation reinvents its monsters, and PCP is one of ours. Not because it's common, it's not, but because it's cinematic. The image of a person tearing through restraints, eyes vacant, body invincible is both terrifying and magnetic. It's Frankenstein for the chemical age, proof that we can build things that break the mind instead of the body. And maybe that's why the legend won't die. It's not really about drugs, it's about fear, of madness, of surrender, of what happens when reason stops answering the phone. The story of angel dust endures because deep down, we all know it's possible to lose control. PCP just gives that possibility a name, a villain, and a face we can point to and say, it wasn't me, it was the drug. But in the end, every myth reveals its truth. The tales of angel dust aren't about people who became monsters. They're about people who reminded us how fragile our humanity really is, and how thin the line is between control and chaos, between fear and fascination, between sanity and the void. In modern times, PCP hasn't vanished. It's just gone quiet, showing up in synthetic blends and designer drugs. Every so often, a news headline pops up. Man on PCP climbs billboard naked. History sighs and says, again? By the turn of the millennium, America thought it had buried angel dust for good. The war on drugs had shifted targets. Now it was all about crack, meth, and opioids. PCP seemed almost quaint, a relic of flared pants and disco balls. But like every stubborn ghost, it refused to rest. The drug never disappeared, it simply changed clothes. By the early 2000s, the world of narcotics had gone digital. Chemistry had caught up with capitalism, and a new wave of designer drugs began flooding the market, each slightly tweaked in a lab to skirt legal definitions. Among them, PCP's descendants emerged, phencyclidine analogues, cousins with names like 3-MeO-PCP and 4-MeO-PCP, the kind of acronyms that sound like broken Wi-Fi passwords. These new variations were even more unpredictable, often sold online as research chemicals, complete with labels that read, "not for human consumption," which naturally guaranteed that humans would consume them immediately. In underground scenes, PCP found a second life, hiding in plain sight among these synthetic cocktails. Some batches of street drugs labelled as ketamine or ecstasy turned out to be dusted with PCP. Users who thought they were signing up for a club night float suddenly found themselves astral, projecting through drywall. ER doctors began seeing familiar symptoms: blank stares, disassociation, superhuman bursts of energy, and shaking their heads. "We haven't seen this since the 70s, one said, and we didn't miss it." The early 2000s internet didn't help. Online forums dedicated to psychonauts, adventurous drug experimenters, began treating PCP and its analogues like forbidden treasures. Long, rambling trip reports filled message boards, written by users who described becoming thought, forgetting they had bones, or seeing time as a flat object. They spoke about it like a spiritual experience, the way alchemists once wrote about discovering gold. Of course, a few posts ended with, "I woke up 2 days later in a parking lot," which should have been a clue. For law enforcement, it was déjà vu. Once again, police reports began surfacing with headlines that sounded like recycled nightmares. "Naked man on PCP bites officer. Woman on dust climbs church bell tower. Suspect on angel dust claims he's a time traveller." The details changed, but the theme remained the same. Confusion, fear, invincibility, collapse. The drug didn't evolve. Humanity just forgot the lesson. And then came the imitators. Synthetic cannabinoids, spice, K2, bath salts started mimicking PCP's dissociative chaos, giving users the same wild detachment from reality. Reporters, not wanting to learn new chemistry, began calling everything like PCP. It became a cultural shorthand again. If someone acted out of their mind, the explanation was always "must be on dust." The myth had survived long enough to outlive the molecule. Even pop culture occasionally resurrected it for cheap thrills. Crime shows like CSI and Law and Order threw it into plot lines whenever they needed a suspect to behave dramatically. Rap lyrics referenced it as a badge of toughness, a callback to the streets of the 70s and 80s. Angel dust wasn't just a drug anymore, it was nostalgia for chaos. The name alone carried weight, like the title of a dangerous movie that everyone pretended not to have watched. Meanwhile, neuroscientists continued their quiet work in the background. The same labs that once vilified PCP now used it to study brain function, PTSD, and dissociation. In one ironic twist, the chemical was being investigated as a model to treat trauma, the very thing it once caused. "We're using low doses," the researchers insisted, as if trying to reassure history that they'd learned their lesson. Still, every so often, the ghost of angel dust reappears. A viral video, a police body cam, a news headline. A man stand on top of a car shouting that he's the chosen one. A woman is found calmly walking down the highway in the rain, eyes wide, untouched by cold. The internet laughs, the cycle repeats, and history sighs again. But beneath the mockery lies something darker. The truth that we never really let go of the myths. The fascination with losing control, the morbid curiosity about what happens when the mind unplugs, it's still there. The names change, the chemistry evolves, but the hunger remains the same. People still chase the impossible, a way to escape themselves completely, if only for a few minutes. And so, the dust lingers. Maybe not in the clubs or in the hospitals like before, but in the collective imagination. The eternal story of a drug that promised transcendence and delivered chaos. In an age of new substances, new fears and new distractions, PCP has become something timeless. The reminder that humanity's worst experiments never really end. They just come back wearing different lab coats. So when that inevitable headline appears, "Man on PCP climbs billboard naked," history doesn't bother to panic anymore. It just rolls its eyes, mutters again, and watches as the same story begins its next rerun. So tonight, as you drift off, maybe take a moment to appreciate just how strange and stubborn humanity really is. We made fire, we split the atom. We invented a chemical that could knock out an elephant and decided to smoke it for fun. That's the story of angel dust, a drug that began in a white lab coat and ended shirtless in a parking lot. It was supposed to numb pain. Instead, it revealed it. The pain of people desperate to escape the weight of being alive for a few hours, even if it meant running through a plate glass window. It promised transcendence, but mostly delivered confusion, and sometimes a police report written in disbelief. And yet, buried under the madness, there's something achingly human. That eternal need to step outside ourselves, even for a moment, to find meaning, or peace, or at least something interesting to look at besides our own reflection. PCP didn't make people superhuman. It reminded us how fragile the mind really is, how easily it can drift away when chemistry tilts too far one direction. But it also showed how much strength hides in the aftermath. The doctors who learned, the scientists who re-examined, the communities who rebuilt. Every disaster leaves behind a blueprint for wisdom, even if it's scribbled in crayon and panic. So as you lie there now, in a warm bed, your heart steady, your mind clear, maybe whisper a small thank you to the quiet miracle of ordinary consciousness, to waking up and knowing who you are, where you are, and that you are in fact not made of light and invincible air. Because history isn't just the story of what we've built, it's the story of what we've survived, and the strange, shining moments where we almost destroyed ourselves in the pursuit of feeling just a little bit more alive. Sleep well, traveller. You've survived the complete history of angel dust, and tonight you don't have to feel superhuman, you just have to feel human.